Take a network break. Help yourself to a virtual donut and join us as we traipse through this week's tech news. We're going to talk about a new firewall for LLMs, an acquisition in the network testing sector, Dutch drama in the silicon business, and more. We're sponsored today by Palo Alto Networks. You can see how ZTNA 2.0, Cloud Secure Web Gateway, and SD-WAN deliver exceptional security and ROI. Palo Alto Networks has produced a virtual event where you can hear how the latest innovations in SASE can help your organization do things like automate costly and complex IT ops with AI-powered digital experience management. Go to paloaltonetworks.com/engage/SASE-signature-moment or see the show notes for episode 470 for the link. And stay tuned after the news. We have a sponsored Tech Bytes conversation with Palo Alto Networks where we're going to examine the challenges of supporting and securing connected medical devices, including threats, vulnerabilities, and regulatory frameworks. We'll also discuss strategies and best practices to manage medical device risks and ensure the confidentiality of patient data. All right, before we jump into the news, we have one follow-up. Last week, Greg, I guess you said that Ukraine invaded Russia, which was a slip of the tongue, and you just wanted to clarify.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks to everybody who got in contact. There was a lot of people, more than 10, who jumped on the various formats. I was getting deluge from all over the places saying, I'm pretty sure you got that wrong. First of all, thank you for assuming that I got that wrong because correct, I did get it wrong, and it is a Freudian slip. Apparently, it was around 26 minutes and 45 seconds. So let me just take a chance to put things right. Now, obviously, Russia invaded Ukraine without provocation in 2014, not 2022, like most people think of. It actually started back in 2014. They annexed Crimea and then invaded the states of Donbass and Luhansk. It's a bit like, first of all, they took the state of Crimea, and then they went to the next nearest states and started to take that over. And then they tried to move into the others. And then in 2022, they actually did a much larger invasion. They tried to do a rapid strike on Kyiv, which was then pushed back. Now, just some history here, which people should know, and I think it's important that we talk about it because I feel strongly about Ukraine, mainly because in 2012, the allies, the Western allies, went to Ukraine and said, we're forcing you to give up your weapons. They had nuclear weapons left over from the Soviet era when the Russians were pushed out of Ukraine as part of the Eastern European Revolution, Freedom Revolution. And the US was central in that. In fact, Barack Obama, who funded $48 million to come in and for Ukraine to decommission all those weapons, and all of the Western countries came along and promised in documents, right, saying we will protect you if Russia invades you, because Ukraine didn't want to give up these weapons, but they were forced to by the Allies, saying this is a precondition for you to join NATO and to join Europe. And of course, a weakened Ukraine then set the stage for Russia to invade it later on in 2014, which Russia promptly did because, they had to decommission a lot of their warships, they decommissioned their nukes, and a lot of their weapons were decommissioned as well. And so they defended themselves from the Russian army from 2014 with nearly no support, which Russia then saw that the allies weren't supporting Ukraine as promised, right, as we said that we would. And then finally, this led to the major invasion in 2022. So all other issues aside, Ukraine, and there's a lot of other issues here. Yes. The West should be helping Ukraine because they promised they would back in 2010, 2012, right? And so where I stand today is that Ukraine isn't asking for allied soldiers to come and die for them. They're not saying you promised you should come. They're saying just give us weapons, money, and political support, which is a really good deal, right? I think you'd agree with that, Drew.
I would, yeah.
And it's very clear that Ukrainians do not want an imperial Russia to rule over them and extract their wealth. And that's the fear, is because when Ukraine was part of Russia, the main Russian politic group would then extract all the wealth from Ukraine and take it back to Russia, to Moscow and St. Petersburg. And of course, let's be realistic here. Ukraine is not a perfect democracy. It's rife with post-Soviet issues. It's got corruption and waste, but that's not a reason to support them in this case. So that's where I stand, just to be clear. Send them all the weapons, give them their chance to build the society they want, give them their chance to be in NATO and in Europe. They'll still have to work hard to change their society, to become part of a Western world. And that's going to be very, very difficult for them. But they're not asking for us to fight instead of them. They're asking us just to help them fight the war on their own, which is extremely, extremely unusual in this era and laudable.
Yeah, I think so. I'm definitely on the side of we should be supporting Ukraine with arms and money as well. And maybe we'll get some FU on that. But we do appreciate the fact that folks are listening closely. So if you hear something that you disagree with,
even all the way down at the end, people aren't supposed to listen to the end of podcasts, they say.
26 minutes deep. That's a good sign.
Yeah, that's right.
That. Yeah, but on any subject, if you have a correction, a comment, anything, we're always happy to have you reach out, packetpushers.net/FU. All right, let's dive into some news so we can create some more FU moments. NetBox Labs is the commercial arm of the open source NetBox source of truth software for network operations automation. NetBox Labs has announced a new on-prem version. It offers enterprise support. Previously, enterprise support was only available if you were using NetBox Cloud, which was a SaaS offering. NetBox Labs is positioning the enterprise version as suited for orgs that are using open source NetBox and aren't ready to transition to cloud or have regulatory or compliance concerns with the SaaS version, but still want enterprise support.
Yeah. So I think the interesting thing here, Drew, is that this is a self-managed on-prem version of NetBox instead of cloud hosted. So now there's always been an open source version of NetBox that you could come and put on-prem, but so if you could download that, but there's been no support. You're kind of on your own, and it's a fork of an open source project that's being supported separately, right? So getting a handle on all of this is fine. I think the interesting part here is that they're now doing self-managed on-prem, which suggests that there must be enough demand here for an on-prem version. So we talk a lot these days about hosted or SaaS products, but to me, it's very clear that even most companies don't want that. So to see companies saying, "Oh yeah, we built it in the cloud, which was convenient for us," but customers are saying they want it on-prem. I think is that a viable comment here?
I mean, I think there are customers who are very comfortable with SaaS, as we've seen in the growth of other SaaS applications. It's very popular, but there are folks who, for regulatory or compliance issues or just discomfort with public cloud or seeing public cloud costs explode, don't want to go the SaaS avenue. So making an enterprise version that gives you that support that you won't get with open source makes perfect sense to me. I assume NetBox would prefer you use their SaaS version because I also assume they are building a data lake filled with lots of interesting information that they will be able to build on top of with new services and interesting things. And you can't do that with the on-prem version unless you get permission to upload data from there into the cloud. But I think that's why they're like sort of cloud first. And frankly, also cloud first, simpler consumption, easy pricing, all that, easy to get folks onboarded.
Yeah.
But I think you're correct that there must have been significant demand for a supported version on-prem, and so NetBox
Cloud's
said,
always
yes,
cheap like a puppy. Once you've got a puppy, that's when the money really starts.
Yes.
Yeah. I think the other side here is that NetBox is primarily a source of truth, which more or less is a way to read, write, and store data about your network. So in effect, its core value is an API that other tools can use, right? It's not actually an automation tool in its own right. So what it really allows you is to have multi-vendor automations to interoperate. So if you've got Glueware and Itential and a bunch of other automation engines, maybe you want to have a common source of truth so that you can have multiple tools, especially if you're starting to use it for servers and VMware and containers and things like that as well, which less common, but generally so. But in most networks, I think it's more of the people who are what I think of as post-artisanal automation, which is a very crowded market. There's a lot of people out there who took on the hype 5 years ago to learn Python and Ansible and to create all the different things, and they've created a bunch of scripts. And now you've got the situation you don't want to abandon that work for personal reasons, like if you've put hundreds of hours into learning all this stuff,
Sure.
Maybe you don't want to let
Yeah, absolutely.
But maybe you've actually developed a bunch of business practices, like help desk operations and stuff around these, and it's pretty difficult to throw them away when they're working for you, right? So I think having a self-managed on-prem version of this makes sense. And just a reaction to this fact of we're still in an era where people are still doing artisanal handcrafted automation around Python and Ansible. The world has moved past that, in my opinion. I think more and more people are going to move up to tools like Glueware and Itential and increasingly AI ops, which we'll talk about more.
And I think if you're trying to do more advanced or sophisticated automation, i.e. not just run a one-off script, if you're trying to build pipelines and workflows and run automations that touch multiple systems, then you need a source of truth or a system of record, or in fact, multiple systems of records or sources of truth, where you are confident that the data you're bringing in is actually correct so that you can make those changes and run those automations with confidence.
Yeah. And you could have, multiple teams writing, some team over here doing SaltStack and another team over here doing Terraform. You still need a source of truth around the networking to say, okay, Mr. Terraform, you can do what you want, but you have to use my source of truth to be able to do that. Or maybe you're using some other, vendor tool and you say, but yeah, you can have your tool, but we're not going to use you as the source of truth. We want you to use this as a source of truth. So.
Right. And instead of having to make calls to an IPAM and an X and a Y and a Z, if you trust that your system of record is relatively up to date, you call that instead.
That's right. Yeah. So you get your system, DCIM, as you say, IPAM, all the other stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
So just to me, it's like that's where customers are, and they're not all in the cloud. That's the reality, is what I'm taking out of this.
Absolutely. All right, moving on. Selector AI, they are a startup in the network AI ops and observability space, has announced that its platform now includes a network-oriented LLM or large language model that network engineers can use to query Selector for things like incident summaries and troubleshooting assistance. Selector, if you haven't heard of it, it works by collecting data from sources like SNMP, network device telemetry, logs, flow records. It can also pull from your existing log collectors and network monitoring products. It takes all that data, it normalizes it, it runs it through its own ML algorithms, and then can provide insights on network behavior, performance, and problems. It's got a Gen AI component called Copilot that already had a natural language process, but in a briefing I got with Selector, they said that its NLP was kind of rigid because what it was trying to do was take your human language query and then map it to their own internal query language behind the scenes. And sometimes those mappings weren't great. So they said that by adding a full scale LLM, the company can get beyond templated responses and let customers ask more interesting questions while still getting relevant answers.
Yeah. So, I mean, I looked at this briefing notes. You took the briefing, so you know more about this than I do, Drew, but they're making some pretty big claims in the briefing, and I'm sort of torn between nah and, maybe AI can do that, so you got to give it sort of, maybe there's some credibility in there. So they talk about a few things in here. It's AI focused on networking. And of course, we've talked about this idea of general purpose AI being unreliable and probably unstable for the time being, and that are more focused AI tools more likely to be accurate and more likely to be right than a non-specific one. And I looked in the briefing page, Drew. They showed that they're using a llama file LLM at the back. I think they might actually change the language model. It might be llama file today, but it might be something else later on. But then they're using a selector LLM in front of that. So what they're doing is filtering down the queries to restrict the possible query space, which means you can't do like apparently right now on the Amazon website, you can just enter in a prompt like, who's the Prime Minister of the UK, and it'll pop up a result for you in the Amazon search window, which is pretty funny. Just in case you wanted a cheap access to a cheap AI prompt interface, you could just use Amazon search. Before they stop it, I imagine. Somebody's got a big weekend ahead of them. So there is this thing where if you put a filter, a selector in front of it, and say we only want to see network related queries, then that's what it is. In effect, it's a AI type of firewall saying I just want to see these queries that are networking related. And they're basically saying that they use a bunch of machine learning across the data and then use the AI component. Now, the thing I note about Selector AI is they've been around for a few years, 5 years, Drew, I think, and they've got like 100.
2019 they were founded, yes.
So they've had a few years to make this suck less than some of the others. So maybe. Yeah, so I sort of feel like they've got some time and some experience in there. They claim that they replace a lot of NetOps tools like Splunk, Sev1, DX NetOps, Zabbix, etc. If it replaces,
I think on their roadmap that they're saying they could get there. Right now, they still work with those kind of companies to populate their data models.
Okay, they sort of said tools consolidation, so I thought
that was part of the roadmap discussion. Yes.
Oh, okay, right. All right.
I didn't headline my notes carefully.
Well, there you go. So we can take it from there. And also, there's a lot of a wide set of third-party integrations. Which are they now? They talk about working with Azure and MySQL and Nagios and New Relic. So, it's not just a networking tool. It'll actually pull data from a wide range of sources or work with a wide range of sources to monitor. So you can say, why is my Oracle database missing in a Slack query, and get a potentially a comprehensible answer or useful answer back.
Yeah, they're starting to integrate more application level data as well, so that your queries have more context. You can get more context in the responses to queries about why something's happening or why something's performing badly. Yeah,
it's kind of interesting. The screenshots that I've seen look interesting to me.
Yeah. So I asked Selector, what LLM are you using? Because I think that may be relevant. They said they're using an open source one, but they didn't want to say which one. And they said they've sort of customized it so much anyway that it's not really the same LLM that it started with. And again, they're not using a general LLM that was trained on every text on the internet. They're trying to focus it on network related data so that you get a smaller domain and hopefully more accurate that way.
In the briefing deck, they say pre-trained LLM llama. So I suspect it's a llama file.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So that would be.
So they gave themselves away in the briefing deck.
A little bit. I mean, I could accept the fact that they took llama file and maybe, took a lot of stuff out of it.
Customized it pretty heavily, yeah.
Yeah. So took the open source llama file and then, cut it down. But they're also putting a Selector LLM in front to restrict the queries to it so it doesn't go off and hallucinate about stuff. So
Yeah. Yeah, so I think, well, this next story coming up proves it, but we are going to be hearing more about AI and network operations. But we will move on. Cloudflare has introduced a new service called Firewall for AI. It's a web application firewall, and it's supposed to get deployed in front of a customer's LLM-based AI applications. It's designed to address threats, including monitoring for sensitive data coming out of an LLM, such as personally identifiable information or financial records, and to monitor for potentially malicious prompts that are intended to produce inaccurate, offensive, or otherwise inappropriate responses from that LLM. Cloudflare says the firewall for AI will assign scores to inbound prompts based on the likelihood the prompt is malicious. Customers can then assign actions on the firewall that it should take based on those scores. And at present, you can only alert on potentially malicious prompts, not block. Cloudflare says blocking will be introduced later.
yeah, announce early and see if anybody cares.
Yes,
Sorry, did I say that out loud?
you did.
I think Cloudflare's probably got a pretty good track record, and this seems wise. Get an announcement out early and judge how much demand there might be,
Mhm.
even though the product is far from complete. What's the point of a firewall that can't block anything? So ask yourself that question, and I'll just point you to all the IDSs of the last 30 years that were in place detecting but not blocking.
Exactly.
Anyway, coming back to reality. So basically what they're doing is applying a text filter on all the queries to your API point for an LLM. So if you want to control what queries are being made on an external LLM. So imagine if your company buys a subscription to an external LLM and you want to know what queries people are making to that. This might be a way to be able to do that. It means you can log all of the prompts and then look for malicious or undesirable patterns. And then you can start to say, I don't want to see these words. So you don't want people going out there and generating, personal stuff, whatever.
Yeah, certainly we know that once you open up a chatbot to the general public will find all kinds of interesting ways to make it say horrible, horrible things. So I think that is the idea behind this firewall. You don't want your customer service chatbot suddenly spouting, racist, sexist stuff that somebody will screenshot and share with the
Yeah,
world.
that's right. And you might also want to be able to log it to see what caused it.
Mhm.
Because, and you might want to do that independently from the LLM itself, right? So
Yes.
yes, although your LLM would track every query, you might want to do it in a way that you can actually look back at those responses to determine, and to validate what's actually happening there.
Mhm.
I think the challenge for me is that I'm not necessarily sure this is a good answer. We've been down this path before with firewalls and corporate networks because an IP network always assumes that everything that's connected to it is a trusted device, right? And then
Right.
we spent how many years building zero trust networks at massive cost and massive overheads, as we all know, right? So if you aren't thinking through the implications of this, you could end up with a situation where you have a corporate policy to put a firewall in front of every LLM, and then suddenly realize that that's a really dumb idea. What you actually want is for the LLM to do the job it's supposed to do, which is to, not do that sort of thing. So if you're just going to use an open, non-specific general LLM model like ChatGPT or, one of the others, then yes, you're going to get this kind of undesirable outcome. But if you're buying a proprietary, targeted, focused, and there's that you're paying somebody to put the firewall in place, having a general purpose firewall like Cloudflare might be a dumb thing to implement as a standard thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess I feel like I understand why companies might want this, if for nothing more than, sort of PR or executive coverage on, oh, well, we did have this firewall in place and we apologize for all the offense that our LLM caused,
Yeah. At
but we did have a
substantial cost
firewall in
and
place.
implications to performance and
Yeah, I
man
just,
hours monitoring the data that's coming out of it that everybody ignores and nobody worries about it. So,
exactly. I guess the other thing I feel like is like, writing firewall rules and IPS rules can already be complicated enough, but at least those are sort of like bounded problems when you're talking about human language with all its richness and its variation, with all of the cleverness people can employ. I think trying to write rules to prevent every conceivable attack is frankly impossible. So I'm not sure how effective this will be.
mm-hmm. Yeah, I just have concerns that this becomes like the sort of thing that an enterprise says, our standard policy is to put an LLM firewall in front of every LLM.
Yes,
And that would
I
be
can
dumb.
see it
You,
quickly becoming the sort of checkbox compliance. Do we have a firewall in front of the LLM? Yes, check.
yeah,
Okay. Are we actually looking at the logs and the records?
yeah. No, but we might one day. Wow,
Right.
that's like IDSs from 20 years ago. What you really want is for the LLM to work as promised, and you don't want to have to put a firewall in front of it, just increasing your costs and your overheads. So
Yeah.
be careful what you ask for. You just might get it.
I guess what's interesting most to me is, we've it feels like the emergence of kind of a new subcategory in the security space. We've seen lots of products that incorporate AI. This is the first one I'm aware of that's meant to defend AI. So I think that's interesting. And I wouldn't be surprised if we start hearing about more capabilities like this coming out from other security companies, in that they're going to be looking at prompts coming into LLMs or looking at data coming out of LLMs to make sure nothing bad is going in or bad is leaking out.
Yeah. Hmm.
Right. We've got show notes, links in the show notes if you want to go find out more about this release. Take a quick break to tell you about our sponsor, Palo Alto Networks. You can see how ZTNA 2.0, Cloud Secure Web Gateway, and SD-WAN deliver exceptional security and ROI. 2024 is a year when companies will need to do more with less. As businesses grapple with economic uncertainty, it's more critical than ever to consolidate fragmented security and networking solutions to reduce operational complexity and costs. Palo Alto Networks has produced a virtual event so you can learn how the latest innovations in SASE can help your organization automate costly and complex IT operations with AI-powered digital experience management, connect and secure branch offices and the hybrid workforce with SD-WAN, ZTNA 2.0, and Cloud Secure Web Gateway, and unlock better ROI through consolidation of point solutions with Prisma SASE. Go to paloaltonetworks.com/engage/SASE-signature-moment or see the show notes for episode 470 for the link. One more time, that's paloaltonetworks.com/engage/SASE-signature-moment. We thank Palo Alto Networks for being a sponsor. Back to the news, some acquisition news in the network testing space. Viavi is acquiring Spirent Communications for $1.28 billion in an all-cash deal. As well, the private equity firm Silver Lake Partners is pitching in $400 million and will become a long-term investor in Viavi. Viavi is a US-based company. Spirent is headquartered in the UK.
Yeah, I'm kind of sad to see these two companies go, merge into one. I think Spirent's been a really good company. And of course, I live in the UK, so seeing companies, go to the US is always bad, a little sad for me. But I think the interesting thing here is that both of these companies are focused on testing and assurance products. And most of their equipment, as I understand it, could be wrong, get in contact if I am, but most of their equipment is targeted at the mega clouds and the telcos, or primarily it was at the telcos, so that they can do signal testing of 4G, 5G networks and bandwidth testing and equipment validation. A lot of it's physical stuff, but they've also got a lot of stuff in the data space as well. And that industry or that market has recently downturned. So we're seeing reports from all of the analyst firms saying that the telco industry has turned down 10% in 2023. So 10% off the top line of the telco industry, that's several $1 billion just disappeared out of the suppliers to those companies. And they're saying that 2024 is likely to get smaller still. And that's why we're seeing this flight. And this is part of the reason, in my view, why, Juniper's going to HPE and Cisco's turning down its numbers and saying things are going to get worse, is because the service provider markets are realizing that they've got no services to sell. They've just got bandwidth, and they're starting to realize that, we rolled out 5G and didn't result in any extra revenue. Sure, we made a lot of savings in costs, but that increases profitability, but it doesn't increase the sales of products and stuff like that. So going to be interesting to see how this works out. So I sort of see this as a good way for these companies who are both top notch at what they do, by the way. And I'm not sure how much overlap. I don't really have a good sense of how much overlap these have, but I suspect there's some overlap. And so I suspect we'll see some of the products will be end of life as they rationalize that out to make cost savings.
Yeah, my guess is this: if their big customers are spending less, then it makes sense for them to tie up, eliminate competing products, just go to one platform, and then have a stronger company. So I'm also not up on whether there's a lot of overlap between these two companies, but yep.
Such a specialist industry, it's really hard to,
It is.
spend several hours reading through their products and going, You really
There's
need
a
to be
lot of
focused.
layer one stuff that's, if you're not in it, is a little dull.
Yeah, there's a lot of things like, how do you test a 400 gigabit per second PHY module? It's like,
Right. Yes. And
you
if
need
you
to make
need it,
sure
you
that,
need it. But
yeah.
yeah,
If you're building boards, then you need a piece of equipment that's more accurate than a normal PHY at 800 gigabits per second or a 1.6 terabit tester. Well, that's a thing. That's a market, right?
it is. Yes.
And you
But I
have to do
guess,
all of that investment up front. And then if customers don't buy much equipment, you've actually got a problem, right? You can't not make the equipment, but then it's how many times can you sell it? That's a tough market to be in.
yeah. Yeah. We like to get into the weeds, but there are weeds and then there are weeds. So can't get into everything.
That's right.
All right, links in the show notes if you want to read up on it. We will move on. Nutanix, they make hyperconverged infrastructure. They're partnering with Wipro as a new business unit that will, according to the press release, quote, help mutual clients accelerate their digital and hybrid multi-cloud journeys and maximize the value of their Nutanix cloud investments. Greg, were you able to make any sense of that?
Yeah, well, for my money, Wipro is what I call a customer-focused business, Drew. Just to translate that, that means we do whatever our customers ask us to.
Mhm.
And so the logical conclusion that you can make is that customers are asking Wipro to add Nutanix to their outsourcing deals because Wipro is largely an outsourcing organization and professional services organization, largely through outsourcing contracts or through subcontracts.
Mhm.
I take this as a sign that doesn't necessarily mean that customers are jumping ship from VMware, but there's enough of them going to Wipro to say, what are you doing, Nutanix? And they've gone, well, we should, because obviously they haven't been, Drew.
Well, I
So,
think they did have an existing relationship, but they have
mm,
now made it an official new business unit. So I
mm,
guess that does indicate significant customer interest to make it its own business unit.
yeah. So I think this is a sign that VMware is still working hard to get their new messaging across to customers. But the situation is probably out of control, and Broadcom doesn't seem to be doing a whole lot about, you know, talking about the value of the new situation. And if they are doing it, customers aren't hearing it in a broad enough sense to be able to stop them from considering their options. Where 6 months ago, people wouldn't have considered their options. I think this is a sign that customers are considering them and they're turning to their suppliers to say, what would happen if we went to Proxmox or Nutanix or one of the other alternatives?
I mean, absolutely. Folks like Nutanix, OpenShift, they should all be seeing opportunity here because Broadcom, because of the acquisition, because of Broadcom's really like straight
Mm.
up, we're just cutting things, we're moving things, we're rearranging how we sell to you, has created a lot of confusion in the market. So there is opportunity here if these companies are nimble
Yeah,
enough to take advantage of it.
I don't think Broadcom's approach was necessarily wrong. Like, go hard, get it done, cut early, get the pain, and then move on. But
Yes.
I'm not necessarily sure that that's quite working the way that they thought it might at this point. Remain to be seen. I think you get a couple of more months to prove that you've got the situation under control. But the signs are there that the situation might be getting away from them.
Yes. And speaking of Broadcom and VMware, Broadcom is officially ditching VMware's end user compute business. Broadcom is going to sell the business unit to KKR, that is a private equity firm, for $4 billion, or approximately $4 billion. When the transaction closes, the end user computing division will become a standalone company. VMware's end user computing portfolio includes virtual desktop and endpoint management offerings, Workspace ONE, and VMware Horizon. KKR says the existing management team is going to continue to run the new business, and KKR says it will expand R&D and make significant investments in go-to-market functions. But I'm willing to put on the spreadsheet that probably won't happen.
I could bet money that they will increase go-to-market functions, Drew. That means hiring a lot of salespeople.
Okay. I guess I was
Go-to-market
thinking more of the
means,
R&D side, but yeah.
yeah. I mean, it's possible that they'll expand the R&D. That sounds more like a tax break. We can. Yeah, there's a lot of things on the books that maybe could be called research and development and get a tax break. But there is a motto in the industry: when private equity gets acquiring, you should start migrating. But I'm not 100% sure where you go, Drew. Like, where do you go? Citrix? Where do you go for end user compute these days?
Right.
So really, there's not much to say about this except to say that Broadcom has done what was expected, and I think didn't get covered a whole lot. It was pretty quiet. The sign that they sold it to a private equity firm is probably a sign that they wanted to move quickly. They didn't want to have
Yes.
any, they didn't want to go and try and sell it to Cisco or some other name brand who would have to faff around and take it to the share market and blah, blah, blah. They just
Right.
wanted to get rid of this as quickly as possible, which is this story I'm saying, like, they're going to cut quickly, cut hard, get the bad news behind them and move on. This is part of that narrative that I think is worthwhile.
The sale isn't a surprise. Broadcom had announced that it would spin off the EUC and the Carbon Black business units back in December of 2023. So I guess they did find a buyer now in KKR. I've read one news story that said this business unit was doing about $2 billion a year for VMware, and KKR is picking it up for $4 billion. So not a bad buy for KKR. They can just probably let it run for a few years and recoup their investment.
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. It'll be interesting to see if they can make it. I mean, how long can you retain those customers? Does end user compute, does this EUC, does this thin client type stuff stay around? Or do people just migrate away to thin client on Azure?
I mean, I feel
Hmm?
like it's kind of a running joke in the IT sector that 2020X is the year of virtual desktop, and it never is.
Hasn't happened in 20 years. It's also the year of video conferencing and the year of
Right.
Linux
The year of
on the
Linux
desktop.
desktop, et cetera.
Yeah,
Yes.
et cetera, et
But,
cetera. Yeah.
$2 billion a year, that's a significant revenue. So there are people out there using it and probably who will continue
It
to
has
use
to be
it.
said that the business was underinvested at VMware. There is, so, a modest increase in R&D, and maybe the product does become more compelling. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe.
Hmm.
Yep. As always, links in the show notes if you want to learn more. We will wrap up on one final story. ASML, that is the Dutch company that dominates the market for lithography equipment required to fabricate high-end silicon, is apparently clashing with the Dutch government about plans for ASML to expand abroad. This is according to reports. ASML is worried that new government restrictions on immigration, including caps on foreign workers and the removal of tax breaks for companies that hired skilled foreign workers, will affect the company's ability to attract talent to the Netherlands and grow the business. And the Dutch government is reportedly in negotiations with ASML. The company has said it won't quit the Netherlands, but it hasn't ruled out opening facilities in other countries. According to Reuters, ASML says it needs to double the size of its operations to meet increased demand for its equipment.
So the secret here, of course, is that ASML has like 80% market share of the most advanced EUV lithography. So there are other companies who make lithography machines, especially Canon out of Japan. Samsung's got some of their own. There's a couple of others, but usually they're way behind the leading edge. They're right the way back at sort of like 20 nanometer, 80 nanometer, 120 nanometer type stuff. ASML has an absolute lock on EUV lithography, which is what you need when you're running at 3 nanometer, 2 nanometer, 1 nanometer type stuff, right?
Mhm.
And so the types of people who would work on this equipment are really right. This is a very unique thing, Drew.
Yes.
This is
Right. Yes.
So
this is
if I
material
was
science. This is physics. This is hardcore.
honestly magic, they just need people who can, the
Actual
more I
wizards.
study, yeah, the more I study up on EUV lithography, it's like, right, sure, yeah, that's like, there's no way. Anyway, ASML probably wants to be able to access people from all over the world so it can grow, right? It's got demand now, and if it waits too long, competitors can emerge, and maybe the opportunity to meet that demand would be lost. So I imagine their customers learn a lot about the equipment, and they might be really good people to hire, right? So if you've got a bunch of, PhDs in Taiwan working for TSMC who've got, 30 years experience on ASML equipment, maybe you want to hire them to help build your next generation equipment or help you, ship to new markets in the US. And you don't really want to wait for universities to create new employees in about 5 to 10 years, something
Right.
like that. And then
Right.
for them to get 5 years of experience so you can do the next phase. I'll also point out that this is one of these issues where politics and business exist in a love-hate relationship. Business
Yes.
loves politics when it goes their way. They hate it when it goes the other way. Politicians love business when they bring in tax revenue, but they hate it when they don't do it, sort of. So there's that tension.
Yes.
Recent Dutch elections saw a surge to right-wing nationalist politics. So with a
Right.
person,
There's a lot more anti-immigrant sentiment in the country, which ASML is like, we need them.
yeah, that's right. So the party, I believe there's a party in charge. I don't know the name of the party, but Geert Wilders, I think. I apologize if I just got that wrong. Anyway, his politics, which is a nationalist party, took the largest delegate share. Now, if you aren't aware, Dutch politics is a multi-party system. So it's not like a two-party system like some countries in the world. And so when you have an election there, it's a multi-party system, and forming a government requires cooperation between some number of political groups to form a majority.
Yep.
And right now, that nationalist party cannot find any allies. So basically all the other parties in the Dutch parliament, they are only able to get about 35% of the vote, of the delegates, 35% of the proportional representation. And so they're not able to form a government because nobody wants to be with them at all. Nobody wants anything to do with them except for themselves. And so most likely there'll be a technocrat coalition forming of several other parties. And so that's sort of the background here, is that there's this politics. There's actually no government in charge of the Dutch system right now, that people are trying to form a government and so on and so forth, and it's quite complicated. But like much of Europe, there's a lot of reaction to what's been happening, with China and to what Russia's done in Ukraine. That's led to a wave of nationalism, which to some extent, the evidence is starting to become clearer that is actually funded by Chinese and Russian operations, disinformation operations. And so it's very easy to whip up a sort of a storm around that. But ASML is sort of stuck in the crosshairs. They want to get bigger. They've got orders for phenomenal numbers of these machines. and they can't fulfill them because they don't have enough people to build them and to install them and to design the next generation of them. So
Yeah, there's
must
a
be a
huge
tough
movement now among other Western countries to sort of re-onshore their home silicon manufacturing capabilities. And so
Mm.
if you're going to do that, you do need machines from ASML. So their market is expanding. Yeah, so they do see potential growth and they need to expand to meet it. I think one of the other issues here is that the Netherlands has already lost two other global giants, Shell and Unilever, which moved their headquarters out of the Netherlands. So there's that
Mm.
sort of loss of prestige and economic strength. Like
Yeah.
imagine Intel back in its heyday leaving the United States. That would have been embarrassing to the United States.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and then there's the political aspect of it, the anti-immigration sentiment that's on the rise in the West, including the U.S.,
Mm.
running into
A lot of
the.
that is disinformation, you know, like
I
a lot of that right
don't
wing
know about
stuff is,
that.
no, for sure. I'm
I
convinced that,
think that what's
it
information
moves
about
around.
immigrants might be disinformation. The sentiments, I think, exist in a lot of people.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Anger
But you can
sentiment.
stir it up
Yes,
by
yes,
getting,
yes.
a very
Absolutely,
modest
yes.
disinformation campaign about,
Can definitely accelerate it. Yes, it can
yeah.
be an
I mean,
accelerant.
just stated, I've seen various leaks out of the Russian government where hackers have got in and stolen, and you can actually see they release the FSB playbooks on this and how they do it, right? And it's absolutely, and people are going like, well, that's obviously what's happening. So,
Yeah, yeah. So just I guess we can put this in the file of that uncomfortable intersection of politics and technology.
yeah, can't
All
get
right,
away
plenty of
from
link.
it.
Can't
Especially
get
when
away.
you're ASML and you're like the key to the modern, to the next
Yes.
era. But I mean, even TSMC is doubling down. They've just built more fabs. They're committing, I think it's 20 billion to build three in the next 3 years or something. Just
Hmm.
phenomenal sums of money and they've tried to build them in Japan and they've tried to build them in the Philippines, trying to build them in America, in Arizona. They've got other ones, but all of those get stuck. But when they do them in Taiwan, they get done in 3 years. When they do them in other countries, they take 10. So you work it out.
Yeah. All right, that wraps up the news portion of the show. As always, if you want to weigh in on anything we said, packetpushers.net/FU. We love to hear from you. Do stay tuned for our conversation on securing medical devices. We're going to talk about that with sponsor Palo Alto Networks. That's coming right up. Medical devices are an essential element of patient care. They're also network-connected devices that need resilient connectivity and security. On today's Tech Bytes, we examine the challenges of supporting and securing connected medical devices, including threats, vulnerabilities, and regulatory frameworks. We'll also discuss strategies and best practices to manage medical device risks and ensure the confidentiality of patient data. We're sponsored today by Palo Alto Networks, and our guest is Tapan Mehta, global leader, healthcare strategy and solutions at Palo Alto Networks. Tapan, welcome to the podcast. So what are some of the trends you're seeing when it comes to the usage and adoption of connected medical devices?
When you look at the connected medical devices, it's an interesting area because if you look at these type of devices, first and foremost for the audience, when you talk about medical devices, this includes everything from patient monitors, infusion pumps, portable modalities. Typically, you would see in a hospital, you would see in a patient room.
Mm-hmm.
And these devices are on the front lines of providing care. And they are a direct correlation to how an individual experiences the care they're receiving. And as such, it plays a very important role in driving the patient outcomes. And if you look at some of the underlying trends in the market, the number of these devices are going to continue to proliferate. In fact, Gartner indicates that by 2030, you're going to have 1.3 billion of these devices in an environment. And in fact, a lot of these devices in a typical hospital setting outnumber the traditional IT devices that you have.
Oh, for sure. But not only is it the number of them, it's also the weirdness of them. Like you're talking about 15-year-old CAT scan machines.
Yes.
And the cost of replacing them is $2.5 million just for the machine, and it's $1 million to install it because you probably have to blow out a wall to be able to carry it out because it's
I mean, you're exactly right. I mean, a lot of these are legacy devices. They have a long shelf cycle, and they are around for 10, 15 years, and in fact, you'll find a lot of outdated OS running on these devices. And it's a funny story that I have. That I had a customer a few years ago, and I found the actual server that manages a lot of these devices sitting, I kid you not, underneath the front desk in the lobby.
yeah.
Right? I mean, how crazy is that?
radiography, you'll often have a server under the desk in a scanning suite next door. So if you've got an X-ray machine, then there's quite often a server sitting under the desk running the administration suite, or or a bunch of servers nearby doing the scanning type of data. And the weird thing about them is they're so hard to secure because they're often like not inherently secure they're insecure, and trying to find a way to make them secure is incredibly difficult in a medical environment where you can't go in and say, hey, this is insecure, you need to turn it off.
Yeah, and a lot of these, as we know, are regulated devices. So you are, bounded by certain things that you can and cannot do. Some of the interesting stats that I've kind of, found is when you just look at the medical imaging systems, right? All the DICOM systems, right? You mentioned CT machines or MRIs or PET machines. 83% of these DICOM systems or medical imaging systems are running end-of-life OS. So I'm like, you wonder, well, how many times do we update our software on our iPhones or on our laptops, right? Just every few months.
So I guess there's two questions I wanted to ask about that is, you can't touch them. We probably know that they're vulnerable. We certainly have to assume they're vulnerable. How does Palo Alto Networks come up with a solution to be able to say, I can secure those? Because it's not immediately obvious how you would do that.
Yeah, I mean, there are many ways in terms of how one could go about securing these devices. But the first thing that we have to remember, in order to secure these devices, you need to know what you have in your environment. So that kind of goes to the visibility or device discovery and knowing, in essence, what is on my network. Because a lot of times organizations have no idea. You would have nurses hiding infusion pumps in the closets before the shift begins because they know they are going to need those infusion pumps and they don't want to spend time looking around or chasing one down. So they hide them. So what ends up happening is typically a hospital will end up over procuring those infusion pumps. In reality, they may need only 40, 50% of them at a given time. The rest is just floating around because people are hiding them in the closet.
Yeah. So there also may be mismatches with an inventory system.
And a lot of times, when we talk with customers, when we ask them, hey, what type of devices you have in your environment, then they chuckle. Say, well, we know what we have, but there are a lot of them, we have no idea what's in your environment, right? So to kind of going back to the question around, well, what does Palo Alto do is the first thing, we have a solution called Medical IoT Security Solution. And this is a cloud delivered security service that can be consumed by customers. It can run on any of our firewalls. It's agnostic, doesn't have to be hardware firewall, software firewall, or SASE. In essence, customers would consume this as a subscription service, and you turn it on, and within a matter of minutes, it will start, identifying the devices that are in your network. Now, I'm, simplifying it because there's certain aspects that one needs to look at, but the starting point or the table stakes is having visibility in these devices. And once you have visibility in these devices, then you can start doing the real stuff, which is around how do you secure them? How do you enforce policies? How do you really make sure that you have a closed loop system in terms of everything from visibility to segmentation and enforcing policies to driving automation, right? So these are all critical elements that one needs to think about as they think about securing devices. If somebody's telling you, hey, you get visibility and you're good to go, that's not good enough. We're doing a disservice to our customers if that is the only thing that is being provided, because the reality is these devices, as we know, are extremely sophisticated and they're becoming smarter by the day. And the level of technology and innovation that goes into these devices is going to continue to go up. So it is absolutely paramount that we provide healthcare organizations, the complete security and visibility.
I mean, the challenge for me is if you've got all of these weird devices in there, how do you fingerprint them, right? How do you identify them? Because you can scan for MAC addresses these days. You can scan for IP addresses and then resolve a MAC address. And then you can how do you go through a network like a medical network, like a hospital network, and start fingerprinting devices safely? And then how do you identify them? How does this fingerprint identification, like, how can you say that's a blood pump, that's a blood pressure cuff, that's a blood pump, or that's a CAT scan type stuff? How do you know that?
Yeah, great question. And there are multiple, ways we do that. And you kind of touched on a couple of things, right? And there are different attributes, as I should say. You can look at the MAC address, you can look at the IP address, you can look at the log data, you can look at the network traffic that is traversing from point A to point B. And what we do is once you have those multiple different attributes, we have, through our medical IoT security solution, we have harnessed our AI ML algorithms that is constantly monitoring these different attributes. And it's a passive behavior monitoring, so nothing to worry about on that front.
So what you're saying is you can scan for the device, look at the MAC address, but then you can also look at the types of traffic that it's generating in the network, because Palo Alto is going to be able to see the packets going through a security device or through the network at some point. Is that right? And you're going to be able to fingerprint it and say, oh, yeah, I recognize that or it, because I've got enough data across the globe, because you're a global company. You're collecting data from everybody. You got to say, is that the sense here?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And we have access to a lot of data. We crowdsource a lot of the data, right? So we can leverage that crowdsource data. We can leverage these different ingestion points through the algorithms, and that gives us, a 95% plus confidence saying, hey, that device is a GE X-ray machine, or that device is a Welch Allyn patient monitor. But that is definitely, one of the ways where we can identify with a high level of accuracy what those devices are in the environment.
Right. What about devices that are mobile? Obviously, a CAT scanner, an MRI is not moving around the hospital, but an infusion pump could. A device, some other medical scanner could. So how do you track them as they move around the physical campus?
Yeah, I mean, this is all, a lot of the traffic, not a lot, all of the traffic for the most part is going to traverse through a firewall that a healthcare organization has deployed in their environment, right? And again, it could be in the cloud, it can be a physical firewall. And because we are really looking at the traffic that is going through our firewall, the location of these devices, as you mentioned, the mobile devices, it doesn't matter as much as long as, our firewalls are positioned architecturally in the right perimeter. So in the east-west traffic corridor, we can capture the traffic. Or for the large part, you will also have customers sitting, having firewalls placed in the north-south corridor through the core data center where we're capturing traffic, right? So you're going to have your core that where the data is going to go through. So we will have covered both these corridors and allowing us to capture the traffic and kind of watching the behavior of these devices, regardless of where they're moving around. Now, there are instances where sometimes we may not see it, and we may have to do DHCP traffic. We may have to do, span the ports. So there are techniques that we can deploy if we say, hey, we have only 95% of the devices that we are seeing, and the other 5%, we have to try something different. So we do have those mechanisms available to definitely try to capture those devices.
So you've got the identity part. What about securing the devices part? Because if we're dealing with, as you mentioned, end-of-life operating systems, there's probably lots of vulnerabilities out there. They're exploitable and they are connected to a network, but often you can't put software agents on them. So where does the protection element come in?
Yeah, it's a great question. You're exactly right. Because these are regulated devices, because these could be class 1 or class 2 devices, one cannot really muck around with the OS, because that's just by the by the nature of those devices. So we have different means whereby we can push the policy enforcements onto our firewalls, and those policy enforcements will allow the user to manage those CVEs or vulnerabilities that they may see in their environment.
There's a key here. You're actually saying that once you've fingerprinted these devices, you can actually then correlate them to known CVEs and then start to say to people, I recognize this device as vulnerable in this way, therefore you should do something about that.
Exactly. And in fact, we go a step further. Not only we provide those insights to the users, we will actually stack rank those CVEs from a priority standpoint, high, medium, low, because as one would expect, there are hundreds of vulnerabilities that you may see through these thousands of these devices, and it would be nuts, if you're kind of looking at all of them saying, hey, these are all real. So what we do is we assign a risk score to these devices and the behaviors and the CVEs, whereby you can really focus on the high or medium, and the rest you can, look at it at some another time. So you're really giving, a more refined way of prioritizing of how you go about, mitigating these vulnerabilities that you have through these devices.
And I'm also going to assume, since it sounds like that the firewall is the primary focus here, I presume Palo Alto is able to set up rules to say this type of medical device should only access, say, our storage network, and then, a known good, maybe a manufacturer server to get new updates and so on.
Shouldn't be connecting to a Russian server.
Right, it shouldn't be. Yeah. It shouldn't be open up an HTTP connection. It shouldn't be going out these ports and so on.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting because we will actually, through the medical IT security solution, flag, if all of a sudden one fine day you have a DICOM system talking to a server in some remote part of the world, like, oh, that's interesting. And the solution will send an alert based on the policy that has been set up. Hey, you may want to check this because this device all of a sudden is starting to correspond with the server that didn't exist until yesterday. And on the flip side, you may have certain anomalous behavior in your environment, which may be okay depending on where the destination is. So you can kind of set a rule to override that, saying it is okay for this X-ray machine to talk with this server in Iowa, where we have our data center, right? That may be okay. So that way you're not being flagged for a perfectly normal behavior. So you kind of get best of both worlds in making sure, how the traffic is behaving. And it also, you can look at the blast radius. So if the device is compromised, what is the ramifications in terms of the damage potentially, because...
Now, there's a lot of ways to do this, but this is very doable if you have Palo Alto networks equipment in here, you can basically just start turning this stuff on, right? This is sort of part of XSIAM and the Prisma capabilities.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the beauty is, as I mentioned, is the cloud delivered security services. If you're a Palo Alto customer today, you just turn it on.
Yeah.
And it in a matter of minutes, it starts, picking up the traffic and starts identifying the devices in your environment.
There's definitely more here we could talk about, but we are at the end of our time. So thank you to Pan, and thank you Palo Alto Networks for being a sponsor. If you're interested in learning more, Palo Alto Networks is having a hands-on workshop on March 21st over Zoom. There will be a link to that in the show notes that accompany this podcast. They're going to have experts on hand to show you how to achieve comprehensive zero trust security for medical devices, and you'll learn how to do things like accurately discover all connected devices, protect your healthcare organization from known and unknown threats, automate policy creation with one-click enforcement, and improve patient outcomes with focused operational insights. So again, that's a workshop on March 21st, and you can find the link in the show notes that accompanies this podcast, along with other links from Palo Alto Networks. Thanks again for joining us. As always, you can find many more fine free technical podcasts and our community blog, all at packetpushers.net. You can follow us on LinkedIn. You can hear us on Spotify and rate us on Apple Podcasts. And last but not least, remember that too much networking would never be enough.